Right now, somewhere in a garage, a barn, or a backyard, someone is about to pull the cord on a chainsaw. The instant that chain starts spinning, a device smaller than a deck of cards becomes the only thing standing between that person and a life-altering injury. It's called the chain brake. Husqvarna invented it in 1974. And here's the part that should make you angry. It took 21 years, an untold number of preventable injuries, and a bitter industry war before the law finally forced every chainsaw maker on Earth to include one. This is the story of how a single engineering decision saved an estimated 1 million lives worldwide, and very nearly destroyed the company that created it. To understand why this story matters, you have to go back to the 1960s. This was the golden age of industrial logging. Chainsaws had replaced axes and two-man crosscut saws, production quotas were climbing, and machines were getting more powerful every year. But it was also an era of absolute brutality. These early saws were massive, heavy, raw beasts of iron and steel. There were no anti-vibration handles, no automatic chain catchers, none of the ergonomic thinking baked into modern equipment. In the most literal sense, they were death machines with a throttle. Out in the woods, safety wasn't really a concept, it was a personality trait. The prevailing philosophy of the era was brutally simple. If you got hurt, it was because you weren't skilled enough, weren't fast enough, weren't careful enough. The machine itself was never considered the problem. The human holding it was. That mindset shaped an entire generation of loggers who worked every single day on the edge of survival, because the culture told them injury was a personal failure rather than a mechanical inevitability. For a logger in 1965, having a long, injury-free career didn't necessarily mean you were the best in the crew. Often it just meant you'd been lucky. Catastrophic injury wasn't treated as a remote possibility in this industry. It was treated as an expectation, quietly absorbed into the culture as the cost of doing business. Nobody was tracking a single root cause. Nobody in a position of power was asking whether the tool itself might be broken by design. That question wouldn't get asked seriously for almost another decade. And when it finally was, it came from a group of engineers who refused to accept the industry's excuses. The silent killer in the woods had a name: kickback. And if you've ever wondered why a modern chainsaw feels safe enough to hand to a homeowner, it's because the entire modern saw was engineered specifically to defeat this one terrifying phenomenon. Kickback happens when the moving chain near the tip of the guide bar, what the section engineers grimly call the danger zone, strikes a hidden knot, a nail, or gets pinched mid-cut. Because of the way the chain wraps around the tip, that section of bar acts like a fulcrum. The torque of the engine and the inertia of the chain combine into a violent rotational force, and the entire saw snaps backward and upward in a fraction of a second, faster than a human nerve impulse can even register, let alone react to. There's no ramp up, no warning growl, no chance to brace. The bar simply reverses direction and comes straight back at the operator's face, neck, or shoulder. That's what made kickback so uniquely horrifying compared to almost any other workplace hazard of the era. There was no sound cue, no visual cue, nothing to dodge. There was just the engine's scream, a sudden violent jolt, and then the aftermath. Thousands of loggers went to work on ordinary mornings and either didn't come home or came home permanently changed because of this single mechanical blind spot that the entire industry had simply learned to live with. For decades, kickback wasn't seen as a design flaw. It was seen as weather, an unavoidable hazard you just had to hope you'd dodge that day. In the early 1970s, inside Husqvarna's engineering division, a group of designers looked at how casually the industry accepted this death toll and decided the status quo was, in their words, morally bankrupt. They rejected the idea that accidents just happen. They saw a mechanical problem being disguised as a human failing, and mechanical problems, they reasoned, demand mechanical solutions. Their answer was the automatic chain brake. And the elegance of the design is exactly why it was such a breakthrough. The engineers understood something the rest of the industry had ignored. You cannot design a safety system around human reaction time, because kickback moves faster than any human can react. So instead of trying to make the operator faster, they made the machine smarter. The brake used the physics of kickback itself as the trigger. The sudden rotational jolt of the saw activated a spring-loaded band that clamped down on the drive sprocket, stopping the chain in a fraction of a second, often before the operator even registered that anything had gone wrong. It was a strange thing to sell in 1974. Husqvarna wasn't just introducing a new accessory. They were quietly telling the entire industry that every saw sold without this feature was fundamentally unsafe. That is not a popular message to send to your own competitors, your own retailers, or even your own sales force. But the engineering team pushed it through anyway, embedding a piece of safety technology into their saws that added cost, added weight, and solved a problem most of the market didn't want to admit existed. It was by any measure a bet against the entire industry's business model. You'd think that after Husqvarna solved a problem that had been killing and maiming loggers for decades, competitors would rush to copy it. You'd assume the industry's collective response would be something like, "This saves lives. Let's make it the standard immediately." Instead, the industry launched a campaign of resistance that lasted 20 years. This is where the story turns genuinely ugly. Rival manufacturers argued the chain brake was too heavy, making saws more cumbersome across a long shift. They argued it was too expensive to produce, and that the added manufacturing cost would price out the little guy, the independent logger or small landowner who couldn't afford a premium tool. But the most insidious argument, the one repeated for 2 straight decades in trade journals and closed-door lobbying meetings, was that the chain brake created a false sense of security. The theory went like this. If you give an operator a safety net, he'll take more risks. He'll push the saw harder, cut more recklessly because he trusts the brake to save him. In other words, the industry's counter-argument to a life-saving invention was to blame the humans who might be saved by it. It was a textbook deflection tactic. Take a mechanical fix for a mechanical flaw and reframe it as a psychological hazard, shifting responsibility right back onto the user. For nearly 2 decades, Husqvarna stood almost entirely alone on this issue. They absorbed higher manufacturing costs, kept funding R&D, and kept producing what was, by any objective safety measure, a superior product. While competitors sold cheaper, faster saws that cut through wood exactly as easily as they cut through human tissue, the financial toll was severe. Husqvarna was hemorrhaging market share because their saws were, in the eyes of a cost-obsessed market, too safe. This wasn't a marketing disadvantage, it was an existential one. For a period, doing the right thing was actively losing Husqvarna the industrial war. Eventually, the fight moved out of the forest and into the fluorescent-lit hearing rooms of the Consumer Product Safety Commission in the United States. This was no longer a marketing dispute between competitors, it had become a federal case. The CPSC began digging into injury data across both the professional logging and residential chainsaw markets, and what they found was alarming. A consistent, ongoing stream of emergency room visits tied directly to kickback incidents year after year with no sign of slowing. Husqvarna showed up to these hearings prepared, arriving with injury statistics, engineering schematics, and 2 decades of real-world proof that their solution worked. But the broader industry's trade groups showed up too, and they came with deeper pockets. Millions of dollars were funneled into lawyers and lobbyists whose entire job was to delay federal safety mandates as long as possible. The resistance was relentless. Industry representatives argued that regulation would cripple small manufacturers, that government had no business dictating engineering decisions, that the free market should decide which safety feature survived. The fight dragged through the better part of the 1980s. An entire decade of procedural delay, appeals, and foot-dragging that, in hindsight, prolonged exposure to a known, preventable hazard for thousands of additional operators. Every year the mandate stalled was another year of saws sold without a break, and another year of avoidable injuries logged into the record. Through all of it, Husqvarna kept its patents active, kept its engineers working, and kept showing up to testify. The turning point finally came in 1995. By then, the weight of mounting product liability lawsuits, an undeniable mountain of injury data, and sustained public pressure had become impossible for regulators and the industry to keep ignoring. The CPSC officially mandated that automatic chain brakes be a standard, non-negotiable feature on every chainsaw sold. Husqvarna's 1974 invention had become federal law 21 years after its debut. The shift, once the mandate landed, was almost comically fast. The false sense of security argument that had been repeated for 2 decades simply evaporated overnight. Nobody in the industry brought it up again once it was legally required. Almost instantly, a saw without a chain brake went from being a viable cost-saving product to being a liability nobody wanted to manufacture, sell, or insure. Within just a few years, the feature that had once been dismissed as an expensive Husqvarna gimmick became as unremarkable and universal as a seatbelt in a car. The engineering team that had been mocked in the 1970s for over-engineering a solution to a non-problem was completely, totally vindicated. Today, nobody thinks twice about the chain brake. It's just there because a small lever near the front handle that most users have never had to think hard about. On everything from a compact homeowner saw to a professional-grade timber rig. It has fully disappeared into the background of the tool, which is exactly what happens when a safety feature succeeds completely. But look at what happened to the underlying numbers once the standard became universal. Kickback-related fatalities and serious injuries plunged dramatically across the following decades. That's not just a statistic sitting in a regulatory filing somewhere. That represents a generation of loggers who kept their limbs, kept their livelihoods, and kept coming home at the end of a shift. Husqvarna didn't just survive its 20-year standoff with the rest of the industry. It emerged from it as the defining authority on chainsaw safety and professional forestry equipment. By refusing to compromise, the company transformed the chainsaw's reputation from a death machine into a precision tool that could be trusted in professional and residential hands alike. Their legacy was never going to be built on horsepower specs or sales charts. It was built on the invisible math of harm that never happened, the injuries that were never logged, the emergency room visits that never occurred, the families who never got that call. Husqvarna played the long game, betting the company on the idea that they weren't just selling a saw. They were selling a standard of care the entire world would eventually be forced to meet. This story was never really just about chainsaws. It's a case study in corporate responsibility, and in what happens when one company decides that profit isn't the only number worth optimizing for. even when that decision nearly bankrupts them. But it should also leave you a little uneasy, because it raises an uncomfortable question. What other chain breaks exist right now, in 2026, sitting on some engineer's desk, held back not because the technology doesn't work, but because it doesn't fit neatly into a quarterly earnings call? We've seen versions of the same fight play out in construction, in consumer tech, in medicine. The specifics change. The underlying tension, safety versus short-term profit, never really goes away. It just puts on a different uniform each time. So here's what I actually want to know from you. Should governments be legally required to step in and mandate safety features like this one? Or does that kind of regulation ultimately slow down the very innovation that produces better tools in the first place? Should we trust companies to do the right thing on their own? Or does history suggest that the industrial war Husqvarna fought in the 1970s and 80s is simply the default outcome whenever safety costs money? Drop your answer in the comments. I want to know exactly where you draw the line.